All right, what is up, A Pushers? Mr. Bear and Mr. Eskridge here. We are going to cover Chapter 5, the American Revolution. We have gone from being colonists to being Americans. There is such a thing now, starting in this chapter, with the United States of America. So, we will begin at the beginning. So, the roots of the revolution. I'm going to cover kind of the underlying factors that help lead to the revolution, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Eskridge, who's going to talk about some of the causes. So, one of the main underlying root causes of the revolution was this idea of distance, not only geographic distance, but also difference in family lineage and where our colonists were coming from. So, American colonists are increasingly independent. There's a lot of geography, there is a lot of water between England and the American colonies, and that distance of a foreign power starts to really weigh on the Americans. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about some of the taxes and duties. But that distance allows for the American colonists to have some sovereignty to make some decisions on their own. And so it's going to lead to them kind of being resentful over some of the decision making that Britain is doing. There's also the fact that the American colonists were far removed from their British roots. Many of the American colonists weren't born in England. Many of their parents weren't even born in England. So all that they ever knew was America. And because of that, they begin to feel like they're being ruled by a foreign power, that perhaps they still feel like British subjects and they believe that they have all the rights and privileges of a British subject. But the fact that this is a power so far away removed from them is really going to start to take its toll. Americans were embracing Republican forms of government ever since the House of Burgesses was founded, and that's just one example of many. American colonists had pretty much called their own shots. They had a lot of local control of the day-to-day business operations, and they were highly involved in politics. Land is typically the driving factor at this time of whether or not somebody can be involved in the political process. And the simple fact of the matter is that colonists, land was plentiful here in the Americas, and colonists were typically more likely to be landowners than, say, a British citizen living in Manchester, Liverpool, or London. So they were more involved in the local decision making in the political process here at home. And so they're sort of used to making those decisions on their own. So I'm going to turn it over to Eskridge, and he's going to talk about some of the causes, the direct causes of the American Revolution.
All right, hey guys. All right, so as Mr. Vieira said, there's a lot of roots that I think we've really seen starting to coalesce and come together, especially in chapters 3 and 4. But there's some, all of these roots then have kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back, if you will, these direct causes that lead to the American Revolution. Um, so as we talked about in the last unit, the British Empire, and as Mr. Vieira just talked about, the British Empire, for the most part, had kind of had a hands-off approach to the colonies. They looked at the colonies as a primary, as far as being an economic powerhouse and being a source of revenue for the crown. And once once the British had funded the war, had fought against the French and the numerous other European countries that they engaged with during that time. They looked towards the colonists as being a tax base, and that the colonists should have to pay for the war that the British government, British authorities had fought for them. And so this huge debt, as it goes into more details in the reading. So the British Crown and Parliament started to respond by just starting to tax the colonists. So we have some significant acts, as they're called, which just think of as these are taxes. The chapter talks about how they're not direct taxes, they're more duties. So a duty is essentially what you pay, like a pay to use kind of thing. It's not direct tax on someone's income or say that every single person has to pay it no matter what. It's a use per use tax. So we have the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, and the Stamp Act are kind of the three big ones. And we see reactions from the colonists against those acts, against those taxes, against that intrusion into their wallets or their pocketbooks that they weren't used to before. And so Through that, we see numerous legislative actions taken by the assemblies. We see economic boycotts, protests, where numerous segments of the colonial population, from the elites to the middle class to the poor folks, women are all engaged in trying to kind of snub the British royal crown or British authorities, Parliament, and trying to avoid paying these taxes. We also see some of these taxes encourage some vigilante groups, kind of domestic terrorists, if you will. These Sons of Liberty, who are kind of going around and kind of stirring stuff up. We see people being put on blast if they are supportive of the British government, and so basically there's starting to be rising tensions that are going to erupt into actual wars a little bit later on. And another thing that's significant is we see Parliament or the King enacting these acts, enacting taxes, and then we see a response by the colonists, which typically is resistance in one of those different ways: economic, social, political resistance. And then Parliament reneges or kind of backtracks a little bit and gives up some control. But one of the major things that remains is the Declaratory Act, and that basically reserves the rights of Parliament to control the colonies. And that's one thing that doesn't go away and is used over and over again by Parliament, that is just kind of the thorn in the colonial side. So yeah, I'm going to turn it back to Mr. Freer, who's going to continue.
All right, so dealing with a little bit more specifics here again. One significant act that helps lead to the revolution takes place a decade before, and that's the Townshend Acts. This act is relevant. I mean, we have the information there of what it does, but why it's relevant is because the Townshend Act was really a case in point in which the protest movements, whether they be boycotts or active protests, became more inclusive and coordinated. Whereas before, it was typically the elite that were doing one thing, and then mobs of, I would say, common folk, for lack of a better word, were involved in more active protest. And after the Townshend Acts, those two groups start to work closer together, in which the protests, the outward protests were being done by both the wealthy elite and common American colonists. So it sort of the revolutionary spirit sort of takes a different tone after the Townshend Acts are passed. A key event leading to the American Revolution is, of course, the Boston Massacre, in which a crowd was gathered outside a customs office, and they begin to get rowdy. They begin to hurl insults, as mobs tend to do.
Late at night.
Yeah,
Stuff's fun.
Yeah, it's Boston, so there's reason to be angry there anyway. And so 11 colonists are killed or wounded when shots are fired onto a supposedly unarmed crowd. Why the Boston Massacre is relevant isn't necessarily for the loss of life, which of course is tragic. It's relevant because of how it's used. There is an engraving done by, of course, Paul Revere that circulates through the colonies, and it's printed, again, with this print culture that we have in the American colonies. People begin to read and hear stories about the bloody massacre, as today we call it the Boston Massacre, and it's used as a propaganda tool by the colonial elite, by groups like the Sons of Liberty, to sort of spread the revolutionary fervor that's starting to grow. And so the Boston Massacre, of course, is more relevant for the result of it and how it sorts to kind of fans the flames of revolution than what actually happened. After the Boston Massacre, the tone of the colonists actually will be subdued for several years, but it really lays the foundation of this idea of innocence, that the colonists are this innocent group that are protesting for their rights, and the truth in that is subjective, and that they were viciously and attacked by this group of redcoats. Okay, this idea of a massacre, and that there's one side that's completely innocent and the other side just laid waste to them. And so that's something that really isn't going to go away pretty much for the duration of the American Revolution. And so here you have an image based off of Paul Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre, and you can see on one side these unarmed colonists who were basically being slaughtered by British redcoats, and there's a dog there.
All right, hey guys, so we're back. All right, so as Mr. Freer left off with the Boston Massacre, which it was not a massacre. 11 people were injured or killed, and the mob kind of invoked it. But again, as that was used as a propaganda tool, there was another significant document that circulated throughout the colonies, and that's Thomas Paine. And Thomas Paine is an Englishman who comes to the Americas and travels around prior to the Revolution, kind of the early stages in the early 1770s. And what he discovers or kind of writes about, argues for during his travels is that, it does not make sense that there's this essentially independent country already established. There's these self-sufficient groups. They have their political assemblies. They have their economic ways of life. They have their social norms, their customs, and it doesn't make any sense for them, the colonists, to be under the subject of a distant empire that in many intents and purposes they could compete with. And so Thomas Paine writes his pamphlet, which is known as Common Sense, and it circulates throughout the colonies, as Mr. Beard said about the Boston Massacre, based on this, this really widely spread print culture that's going on. And one of the things that Paine also argues for is this idea of Republican democracy. He sees kind of hope in this idea that's going on, that's sort of circulating throughout the colonies, of this, more kind of popular sovereignty where power is held in these local assemblies by the people who live there, and they're the ones that are making decisions, not just political but economic and other things as well. And so he's going to lean on the Enlightenment thinkers as well. We also have the Great Awakening that's causing people to think more independently, kind of questioning these large authoritarian kind of institutions such as the monarchy and such as the church. And what this really does is Common Sense, the text really helps to fan these flames that are growing, that are going to lead towards independence. All right, so I'm going to invite Mr. Pierre. He's going to talk more about the revolution a little bit, or the beginning of it.
All right, so the American Revolution, the start date is Lexington and Concord, which we've talked about before, but really the start date is the Declaration of Independence. So I'm going to cover that very briefly. The Second Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia. And the Second Continental Congress, they create an army, they raise an army. New York is under threat of being invaded by the British Redcoats. They obviously, the general and the commander-in-chief of the First Continental Army is George Washington. And so it looks like at this point in 1775 that they've sent grievances to Parliament. They're largely ignored. But it looks like war is imminent. And then on July 1776, July 4th, of course, Congress decides to declare their independence. And Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence. If we were to read it, it's probably like the greatest breakup letter of all time. That's pretty much what it is. It's, Taylor Swift, eat your heart out. What they basically do is they list a bunch of grievances that they feel the king has imposed upon the colonists and the colonial government. And they explain their reason for independence. Now, the Declaration of Independence is obviously one of the more historical documents in American history, but it's also important for the ideas that it upholds. It's really rooted in the Enlightenment and this idea of natural rights, life, liberty, and property, or as Jefferson calls it, the pursuit of happiness. And it really sets in motion what's going to happen after, which is the Revolutionary War. It's important to note that the Declaration of Independence was as much about action taken by the colonists as it was a notice to the rest of the world that America was breaking from the British Empire. And so not only did Jefferson and the shot callers in Philadelphia want the American colonists to read it, but they also wanted the French to read it. They wanted the rest of the world to read it because knowing that in the long game, they were going to need help to make a clean break from the British Empire. So again, this is not a military history class. We don't cover a lot of military aspects of American history, but we are going to cover some specific kind of phenomenons that occurred during the American Revolution. So here's Eskridge again to go over that.
All right, hey guys. Okay, so as the reading talked about, really the people that fought in the American Revolution on the side of the colonists against the British were a pretty ragtag group of individuals. They're poorly supplied There's not a lot of leadership. It's kind of a haphazard group of people that come together. The majority of them are men. The ones that are actually doing most of the fighting are going to be from the middle and kind of lower classes. And we do have them under the leadership of George Washington, who we remember back from the 7 Years' War, kind of cut his teeth during that war and made a name for himself. And so he is put in charge of the Continental Army and travels throughout the colonies and just, relies on more of kind of hit and run tactics, or what will become later with the Spanish Civil War, what are known as guerrilla tactics, kind of guerrilla war, which is kind of based on knowing the local terrain and then these surprise attacks and then kind of fall back and then attack again while there's still some chaos and confusion going on. So that's really what we see, the battle tactics throughout the colonies. And again, we're not going to go into all those details, but that's kind of the underlying idea there. And we also have, it's significant to note and to remember, is that without the support of the French Navy, without the support of French troops, the Americans would have faced an even more uphill battle. So that reliance and alliance with France really played a key significant role as well. Some other marginalized groups that we see that are able to get a little more agency during the American Revolution are African Americans. The chapter kind of talks about it, where some African Americans, some free African Americans, some enslaved African Americans fought for both sides. The British, guaranteed their freedom if they fought on the side of the British. Some slaveholders would free their slaves to fight on as well, and then we have a large number of African Americans who, just flee from their position as slaves and seeking some independence that may come if the American Revolution lives up to its ideals of liberty and freedom and equality, and all these kind of self-determination ideas. So a lot of Americans, and the chapter kind of talks about that. It's the idea that all American colonists were just gung ho from the beginning to go to war to break up with Britain was just not the case. We do see kind of radical factions within each level of society, the elite, the middle class, or the lower poor groups that are more willing to become separatists and are more willing to fight against the British for independence. But it's a kind of a slow process. So as the war went on, we have more and more people that are willing to risk their lives or their property in order to join the cause. But that's not to say that all of them did. And the chapter does highlight a lot of loyalists and what happened to them later on. But yeah, the Continental Army against the British Army, it's kind of David and Goliath kind of thing.
All right, so one group that in specific we're going to cover are women in the Revolution. Colonial women during the American Revolution kind of have this 360 revolving role in it. First off, colonial women were critical to the Revolution. Women were making most of the economic decisions in the household, and so when there was a boycott, women were likely the ones, the group that was making that decision, that were making sure that things that were supposed to be bought by colonists were being bought and things that were being boycotted were being boycotted. So they had a huge role in making sure that not only were boycotts being carried out, but that they were successful. Women were becoming more and more politically active in the American colonies during the Revolution, gathering signatures, providing political commentaries in the print, in pamphlets, in newspapers. One of the key roles that American women had during the Revolution was homespun clothing. Most clothing at the time was imported from Britain itself, from textile mills in Britain. And so if you were wearing homemade clothing, it was really kind of like a sign of patriotism, that you were with the revolution, that you were with the rebels, that you were an American. And so women really fill that role of in a lot of ways, women are the heartbeat of America, and they were the heartbeat of the American Revolution. Now, when the revolution is over, there's like this 180 in which women are kind of returned to pre-revolutionary roles and become far less politically active. And this idea of the Republican mother takes root, in which a woman's responsibility was at home, the educator and the child rearer, and to raise children, really puts the American woman in the infancy of this country when it first starts into a almost, for lack of a better term, second class citizen role, in which the political activism that you saw that the during the American Revolution for that 10 to 15-year period, it kind of goes by the wayside. And so it's one of the unfortunate consequences of the American Revolution, but it's a fact of the matter. And so to wrap this up, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Eskridge, who's going to kind of cover the ultimate so what of the American Revolution.
All right, hey guys. So I'm gonna just bring it home. All right, so some of that we're gonna start with kind of some of the positive things that come out of the revolution, and then some of the kind of wah 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 or the more sad or negative aspects. All right, so probably the most significant thing that comes out of the American Revolution is this idea of independence. So not just political independence, where we see political independence in the fact that each colony is going to form its own government structure, its own assembly. Some of them have an executive branch or kind of people that are leading, but the majority of colonies establish governments that are very heavily legislative, meaning that there's many people involved in the governing process. So we're going to see kind of the roots of what will become the federal government later on. We have the Articles of Confederation, which are going to kind of be the first attempt at a federal government. We're going to talk more about how those are weak. The chapter kind of goes into it, but we will definitely pick that up later on in the next couple chapters, the next couple weeks. So we'll talk more about that. Another significant thing is the end of mercantilism. So American colonists and the colonies experience economic independence like they had never known before. They are able to trade with who they want to. They don't have to worry about all of these taxes, all these kinds of things that are being thrown on them by England. Any taxes that they want to bring upon their economy are going to come from them. So those are kind of the big significant things. As Mr. Vieira said, when we look at marginalized groups, starting with women, they go back to their kind of former roles prior to the American Revolution, in which they are the caretakers of the home. They're not given as much independence. They're still have to be submissive to the men in their lives, and we see that politically as well as at home and economically as well. When we look at slaves, so former slaves, the British, for the most part, held true to their promises that they would allow former enslaved persons to be able to escape and go to somewhere where they could live out the rest of their lives with some more independence. We see in the South some slave masters kind of reneging on those promises, and we also see people that African Americans that were freed before the war are put back into slavery, or those that gained their freedom during the revolution are put back into the system and are once again made slaves, unfortunately. Also, Native Americans continue to be marginalized, and they continue to be pushed westward, and we're going to see them be pushed westward until the Americans reach the Pacific coast, and then even continuing to this day, where they're looked at as that they're not the original inhabitants, and they're on this land that should be occupied by others. And then kind of the last thing is this, as I mentioned, the Articles of Confederation, and we'll talk about why that was weak later. But I really like the end of this chapter because it really sets up these ideas that we're going to continue to build on. And one thing that I just want to revisit a little bit is that idea of the Declaration of Independence. So it's kind of like, now that we have this thing, we have the American Revolution fought on these ideals of liberty, of equality, of popular sovereignty, of independence, all those things. Like, what are we going to do with it? And that's what we're really going to spend the rest of this course looking at, is people, these marginalized groups and non-marginalized groups that are going to just continue to fight to essentially just live their lives. And they're going to refer back to that, the promises laid out by Jefferson and the founding generation. They're going to continue to struggle and fight for those things that are due to them. So have a great weekend. See you guys on Monday.